Welcome everyone to the first in our Critical Tech Talk series. I'm super thrilled to be launching this even under such strange conditions. In fact, that's one of the reasons we're launching it, is to kind of forget about the strange conditions a little bit and get together and think about things. And we're going to get started tonight. We just have a couple of introductory videos, and then I will introduce our speaker. So with that, you can take it away with the videos. Thanks for coming.
Welcome to the Critical Tech Talk series, and thank you to the Faculty of Arts and especially to Marcel O'Gorman for your work in establishing this series. While we may be meeting virtually together for this event, it's important to acknowledge and pay respects to the Atawandaran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo and much of our community sits on their traditional territories. We also acknowledge that the University of Waterloo occupies land on the Haldimand Tract. That's land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our acknowledgement purposefully names those who've been excluded in the past from our community. It remembers the very special relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the land. It builds respectful relationships, and it serves as a reminder to those who have settled in these lands about our responsibilities to uphold these relationships. At Waterloo, our active work toward reconciliation takes place across all our campuses through research, through learning, through teaching, community building. It's centralized within our Indigenous Initiatives Office, and that office is led by Jean Becker. I'm Charmaine Dean. I'm the Vice President, Research and International at the University of Waterloo. As an institution that's one of the leading producers of advanced technology, research, and impact in Canada, and with our focus on robotics, on quantum, on artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, health technologies, among many areas, optimizing the utility of technology becomes a driver for us, a key driver for us. Yet, we also have to study and be very careful to mitigate risks and harms. Both thought and development processes have to take place, have to be advanced hand in hand. It is our responsibility to ensure that we educate, that we train, that we have conversations about responsible technology and work with our partners as well as design our products to promote and achieve ethical, responsible behaviors, keeping and inspiring social considerations and impact. Thank you for joining us in this series. I'll hand over to Professor O'Gorman to introduce our distinguished speaker and to say a bit more about our purpose and goals today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sheila Ager, and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts. I'd like to welcome you to this inaugural event in the Critical Tech Talk series featuring Dr. Nicole Aschoff. The purpose of this series is to apply critical thinking to the role of technology in modern life and society. Now, I am an ancient historian, and so I tend to take the long view of things, including technology. One of the most significant technological advances in the history of the human race was the ability to create fire. And I'd like to use that particular innovation by way of contrast to what we're facing today. For one thing, the techniques employed in making fire were widespread, even democratic, while modern technologies, although democratic in the sense that their use is ubiquitous, are elitist in that the end users do not necessarily understand how the technology actually functions. We all know how technology can put us in touch with the world, but do we fully appreciate the ethical dilemmas of what can be non-transparent, non-accountable, and non-responsible communication? Fire, when it gets out of control, has very immediate consequences for the user, not invisible consequences halfway around the world. And a fire dies down if it isn't tended by its maker. But increasingly, we're designing autonomous and self-repairing technologies that can run independently of human oversight. Literature is full of dystopian visions of technology controlling humans rather than the other way around. From E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, which I always think should be required reading, to Harlan Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. But as I think this series will show, the humanities, the social sciences, and the creative arts also provide more nuanced ways of applying critical, ethical, and socially responsible thinking to technological innovation, while at the same time not denying its potential for the betterment of human life and society. The Ellison tale inspired the very dark vision of the Terminator films, but if, by controlling its dangerous properties, fire could be harnessed to provide heat, light, and cooking capacity, we can equally reap the benefits of future developments in technology, provided always that we remain alert to their destructive potential. Thanks for listening and have a wonderful session.
Okay, thank you for that. I had a big long introduction, but after that you probably don't want to hear it, so I'm going to skip it. And thank you. I introduced someone last week and they're like, don't say anything, don't even, just say my name, that's all I want. But I do have to say, Nicole Aschoff is, her greatest talent, I would say, as an intellectual and activist, is her recognition of power asymmetries and her kind of unblack boxing of power asymmetries in tech culture. And that's a huge power that she herself has, which is symmetrical power. So Nicole is a writer, editor, and intellectual activist. She holds a PhD in sociology at Johns Hopkins University, and she taught for several years at Boston University. She's currently senior editor at Verso Books, where she's busy kicking ass. And I'm very anxious to hear what Nicole has to say tonight. And thanks for coming.
Thanks, Marcel. I'd just like to start out today by thanking you for inviting me to give this talk and to have a chance to talk with some of you. And I'd also really like to say that I'm so impressed with Marcel and the work that he's doing at the Critical Media Lab. And, you know, this series is just a small part of all of the kind of adventurous and experimental ways that he's trying to get us to think bigger and think more critically about technology, whether it's through art or analysis or, you know, hard theory. I think that Marcel is a really impressive intellectual, and I'm so happy through this conversation that we've been having to plan this event that I've had a chance to talk to him about a lot of our own, you know, our ideas about technology. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what he and the wonderful students that are attending today have to say after my talk. What I'd like to do now, hopefully, if our technology cooperates, I ended up using just a PDF of my presentation. Let's hope that this works. And so you'll see the ugly borders there, but the PowerPoint presentation was taking up too much bandwidth, so we'll just use a plain old PDF. All right, hopefully you can all see this. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the digital frontier, its limits, and how the ways that we talk about the digital frontier shape our technological future. The stories we tell about digital technology are both an expression of current sentiments and a shorthand for an imagined future. So I think it's really important that we take these stories seriously. So in this slide, I've juxtaposed two familiar images, and I use primarily images in this talk because I think that they evoke a lot of sort of reflection and narrative building. So I want you to think about what these images make you feel as I'm talking. So in this slide, I've juxtaposed two familiar images that evoke very different visions of the digital frontier. One we could call the Star Trek vision. It's a vision in which humanity has pooled its talents and efforts in the quest for knowledge and discovery. In this vision, society has marshaled its collective resources, not only to overcome inequality and scarcity, but to push humanity forward together toward a future in which everyone can be a productive and valued member. The photo from the film Ex Machina presents a very different vision of the digital frontier. In this vision, an arrogant, jaded billionaire uses his wealth and brilliance to create a future according to his own design. To create a creature that is beautiful and clever, but ultimately beyond his control. As you know, if you've seen the movie, the somewhat pathetic, ordinary guy tries to save the day, acting according to his own, and by extension the viewer's, moral framework. But he finds that his moral framework no longer applies. He too is powerless to stop the future. Thinking about the ways we talk about digital technology and the digital frontier, whether it's conversations about AI and machine learning, robotics, quantum computing, it's clear that the ex machina vision is much more dominant in our popular narratives. The stories we tell in movies and television suggest deep anxiety about our relationship with machines and about the digital and analog future we are creating. This dystopian impulse is not new, as you can see obviously by some of the photos I've put up here. But as tech leaders breathlessly describe how explosive growth in connectivity, in combination with advances in data collection and storage, computing power, and machine learning has put us on the precipice of something fundamentally new and different. Against a backdrop of skyrocketing inequality and climate change, our fears have become palpable. I think we should take these fears seriously, while at the same time resisting the easy slide into fatalism and despair. If we're going to get a better grasp on how to construct the digital future we want, we need to get our story straight. But getting our story straight isn't always easy. Consider Facebook. In recent weeks, we've been hearing two very different stories. One is a familiar narrative, just with a new storyteller this time around. Frances Haugen, former product manager, who was then assigned to become part of an internal team to prevent election interference, released thousands of pages of internal documents to the Wall Street Journal in what has now been dubbed the Facebook Papers. Everything has a papers after it. The revelations from these documents that Ms. Haugen released aren't entirely surprising, but they're comprehensive in the sense that they capture all of the fears and misgivings that we have about the way Facebook runs its business. So we have, for example, evidence that software engineers and developers at Facebook are aware of the potentially harmful results of Instagram on teen girls' body image, for example. We see evidence that executives at Facebook are green-lighting potentially violent relationships between states and their populations using the platform. We see evidence of mistakes being made over the COVID-19 vaccine and misinformation being rampant. And overall, Frances Haugen telling the story as she testifies before Congress, today she's in Europe testifying, is a story of a company that prioritizes clicks and engagement over safety and profits. And this is a story that we hear very often with Facebook. But we also hear a second story, and this is the second photo I have up here, which is admittedly creepy. This is the story that comes from Zuckerberg himself, who has announced that he's rebranding Facebook as Meta, short for the Metaverse, which the Facebook crew describes as the successor to the mobile internet. Matthew Ball defines the Metaverse as a massively scaled and interoperable network of real-time rendered 3D virtual worlds, which can be experienced synchronously and persistently by an effectively unlimited number of users. The term metaverse, of course, comes from Neil Stephenson's dystopic novel Snow Crash, about the bad things that happen with unbridled corporate power. But Zuckerberg and company insist that Facebook's version will be a utopian project, the next horizon. Zuckerberg's Metaverse story fits neatly within broader Silicon Valley narratives. Tech companies, we're told over and again, are building an architecture of inclusive growth. Their platforms, and now perhaps a metaverse, promise to not only enhance connection, but to bring a new world of interpersonal trust and innovation. Each of us can participate seamlessly, yesterday through our smartphones, tomorrow through our VR goggles and smart glasses. By creating online profiles, sharing and connecting with others in decentralized peer-to-peer networks, we're told, the individual can shine and thrive, gaining not only attention and followers, but also power and potentially money. These networks of empowered individuals, we're told, are creating something from nothing. New consumption experiences, new economic activity. We're growing the pie, making new space for individuals who were left out of neoliberalism. So how do we make sense of these accounts? These two stories that are so different. In some respects, the stories told by Hogan and Zuckerberg diverge wildly. One presents Facebook, to put it crudely, in a sort of ex machina frame, while the other presents a much more Star Trek vision. But in important respects, the dominant stories we tell and hear about digital technology, and this is just one example, whether they are deeply critical or cheerleading the next disruption, are quite similar in what they leave unchallenged and unexamined. The fact, for example, that a handful of private tech companies control infrastructure that is central to modern social, political, and economic life is one that we've essentially resigned ourselves to. We lament that Facebook and Twitter don't do enough to police public speech, but do little to challenge the fact that a few people effectively control public speech. We also quickly skirt around the shocking reality that a few companies are rapidly marketizing new spheres of life, engaging along with government agencies in unprecedented surveillance of ordinary people, and reshaping the future of the internet with almost no oversight or democratic discussion. I would argue that we don't question these things, or at best we offer piecemeal critiques and solutions, because deep down we don't think we can control the direction of digital technology. We believe that it's an implacable force with quasi-metaphysical properties. Even when we're critical of Silicon Valley, we're resigned to letting tech companies shape the digital frontier. We shouldn't be resigned. And this is sort of the point of the book that I recently wrote called The Smartphone Society. I firmly believe we have the creativity, knowledge, and tools to build the digital future we want. But first, as you might guess by the title of my talk, we need to think a bit harder about frontiers, about profit making and power. Effectively, we need to talk about capitalism. Capitalism and frontiers go together in our stories. Indeed, they're linked together so often that we usually picture frontiers in terms of their subsumption into the ever-spreading for-profit system. When we think about how capitalism has spread slowly over the globe over the past 5 centuries, we imagine the frontiers that have brought new growth and change. The New World, the American West, and we often associate these frontiers with new resources or new machines. Silver mines, forests, railroads, steamships. But the process by which frontiers are opened is a bit hazy. This haziness is partly a result of how we talk about the history of capitalism as an inevitable, inexorable process of transforming the world, a natural evolution. The haziness is also a result of the passive language we use. We talk about opening new frontiers, the way we might open a door. To comprehend where we are headed in this technological moment, we need to stand on firmer ground in our understanding of historical change. Frontiers are made, not opened. I'm not really sure if this slide is loading properly, but I have this great late 19th century painting here, which kind of visualizes, oh, it looks like it just loaded there. It kind of visualizes this passive view, this peaceful view. Here it's the, kind of conquering of the American West. And the photo beneath it, and I'm not sure if you can see it here, gives a sense of the actual reality of what that conquering looked like. So to comprehend where we're headed in this technological moment, we need to stand on firmer ground in our understanding of historical change. Frontiers are made, not opened. People make them through creativity, culture, knowledge, technology, blood, guts, power struggles, and lots of hard work. The creation of frontiers in capitalism has often been a brutal, nasty process in which whole societies have been wrenched from their previous way of life and forced into new configurations. Grasping how capitalism evolves and expands, how new frontiers are made, requires putting people rather than machines or digital technology into the driver's seat. So where are the people in capitalism? Most of the time, we imagine them buying things or running businesses or inventing things or working on an assembly line or toiling in a mine. This isn't wrong. These people and the work they do are essential to capitalist development. Equally important, though not usually theorized as such, is all the unpaid work that has gone into creating new frontiers in the history of our for-profit system. The appropriated work of slaves, of colonial subjects, of women. The appropriation of unpaid work isn't new. In her classic work on the transition from feudalism to capitalism, Silvia Federici talks about how the work of cooking, cleaning, healing, raising children became women's work, devalued and reinscribed as a natural resource available to all, while men's work became waged work and thus officially valued. Framing the appropriation of work in this way can help us to understand the present moment. All right, let's hope that loaded. Okay. So in the making of the digital frontier, I would argue that we are once again seeing a reconfiguration of life activities and the emergence of new power dynamics. New combinations of exploitation and appropriation, or crudely, paid and unpaid work, are being formulated every moment. In the tech landscape, small numbers of highly paid software and hardware engineers labor alongside slightly larger numbers of support staff, blue-collar service workers, warehouse workers, and many, many hidden workers. Who are these hidden workers? Miners, assemblers, delivery drivers, app workers, content managers, and perhaps the most hidden of all are the micro workers, toiling for pennies. We see the so-called artificial intelligence, right? We can think about, I put this photo on the bottom here. We actually have refugees who are marooned in refugee camps working for pennies to do these kind of click work tasks. And this is seen, it's presented as a solution to the global jobs crisis, when in fact, we see that this is actually not only extremely exploitative in the sense that these folks are, trying to piece together jobs that are paying them pennies, right? Not even close to making a livable wage, but also how much of their work is actually simply stolen, it's simply appropriated. given the way that these platforms operate. And this is to the full knowledge of the tech companies who run these platforms and actually, provide the fruits of this labor to some of the biggest tech companies in the world, like Google and Facebook. In addition to these kind of new ways of hiding work and exploiting labor through, underpaying or sometimes really emotionally traumatizing conditions, like the middle photo I have here, shows us a picture of a content manager, right? Someone who is actually removing the horrifying content from our home screens, but that he or her have to actually see these images. And this is something that we rarely talk about. But I would also argue that we're witnessing the concealment of unpaid appropriated work on an even greater scale. Work that, like women's work in the past, is being made to appear as a natural resource, a labor of love. And this work is all of our work, the hours we spend every day on our screens, creating content and generating data, or just moving through the moments of our lives with our screens in our pockets. In these hours, our lives become ever more deeply enmeshed in the circuits of capital. Our appropriated work and our digital selves more broadly are the key to the digital frontier. And so I think it's really important for us to really theorize and think about these new combinations of both underpaying labor, but also taking, right? And actually simply appropriating, our creativity, our work, ourselves. When we think about the digital frontier in this way, we see that people are at the center of it all, not as passive subjects or victims, but as workers, creators, and agents of change. When we put people rather than machines or algorithms at the center of the digital frontier, we also are able to open a conversation about the limits of the digital frontier, both in terms of its inherent limits, but also the limits that we want to place on the digital frontier. So limit is not usually a word we associate with the digital, when we're imagining the digital. Instead, the notion of the infinite is pervasive in our stories about the digital future. The romance of the infinite has, of course, echoes in past frontiers as well, if we think historically. When colonists landed on the shores of the American continent in the 1600s, they saw its forests and imagined an infinite number of trees. They were wrong, of course. Settlers had ravaged the country's forests by the middle of the 19th century. Frontiers always have limits, and the digital frontier is no exception. So what are the limits of the digital frontier? And this is a very long conversation, but I think that we can, start talking about it right now. The first limit, since I was talking about trees, is an ecological limit, right? We can think about the cloud, which, unlike its namesake, is actually a dirty, extractive beast in the energy and resources it consumes. When we think about the ICT sector more broadly and its carbon footprint, relative to other sectors, right? It's rapidly growing and expanding, and the ICT sector is extremely wasteful. The digital frontier, despite how we frame our language and the beauty of our devices, is actually designed to foster more consumption and more destruction and more disposal and more production, right? When we think about, we juxtapose this reality to our, fantasies about the experience economy, we see a pretty stark disconnect. We can also think about the limits of the data we generate. There's a broadly shared sense that big data is infinitely useful and durable. But all data, even big data, has a shelf life, after which its profitable use, particularly for advertising, is radically diminished. This limit hints at why tech companies are constantly trying to collect more data, fresh data, hence the metaverse. The second half of Matthew Ball's definition of the metaverse emphasizes how it will provide continuity of data, such as identity, history, entitlements, objects, communications, and payments for its potentially billions of users. We can imagine how Facebook's story of the metaverse, but also their vision for it, in line with their business model, is about marketizing and capturing new spheres of life in an unprecedented way. The tech titans' compulsion to appropriate ever more data by marketizing new spheres of life encourages us to think about the social limits of the digital frontier. Historically, the creation of frontiers has relied on appropriating cheap or free nature and paid and underpaid work. But the ease of this appropriation is not a given. In the past, things that were once considered free forever, always there for the taking, became dearer. Put differently, if we think about the women's movement, it forced us to examine the nature of appropriated work. And in that way, we can examine the arrangement we have with big tech and demand something different. And I put this little patch, this little NROL patch up here, because I firmly believe that examining this relationship of appropriation and challenging it vis-a-vis tech companies is necessary for us to actually curb surveillance, which is equally pervasive and disturbing by government agencies. These tech companies and intelligence agencies work hand in glove, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. So how do we do it? How do we rein in these tech companies? How do we actually challenge their new models of profit making? An important first step, I would argue, is to tell different stories. Most of the stories we hear and tell, even the critical stories, are laden with technological determinism. David Noble, a great historian of technology, has long argued that putting technology rather than people at the center of the story diminishes life, fostering compulsion and fatalism on the one hand, and an extravagant futuristic faith in false promises on the other. Noble says it absolves people of responsibility to change societal problems and weds them instead to the technological projections of those in command. The digital future is designed, developed, and created by humans. The digital frontier is something that we're currently making. Its dimensions are not the product of some implacable force or the scheming of our alien overlords. People, not machines, are deciding the direction of society. And if we don't like that direction, we have the power to build something better. I put a picture of my book here. Of course, that slide loads. I put a picture of my book here. If you're interested in some of these ideas, this is a good place to check it out. And you can also send me an email, and I'm happy to chat with you further. But I'll stop there because I'm really excited to hear what you all have to say and some of your questions.
All right, thank you so much, Nicole. There's so much there to chew on. You mentioned in your book the kind of weightlessness of the apparent weightlessness of digital culture, of the cell phone society. Like we just order something, it appears out of the ether. And I think having that conversation, making it not weightless, requires a little bit of weight, a little bit of heaviness. So if we all feel a little bit heavy right now, maybe that's countering the weightlessness of the the thing we're all going to go order on Amazon tomorrow or something. I want to invite a couple of guests. Well, they're co-speakers tonight, and if you want to just come up, I want to thank our partner Communitech. Actually, Saj Jamal at Communitech actually recommended that we should have some student respondents to bring in some different voices. Oftentimes these discussions and they come from a brilliant expert like we had tonight, and there's often a generational difference. And so here, what we have tonight is a couple of people who are actually on the cusp of this new frontier, and they're both they look scared by that idea, but they're both graduates from the University of Waterloo. So we have Neha Ravella, who is a graduate from English Experimental Digital Media, did her master's degree, their master's degree in 2021. And Neha is currently working for Mozilla in research and product development. And then we have Nolan Day, who graduated with from Systems Design Engineering from Waterloo in both undergrad and grad. And Nolan is currently working for, I keep wanting to say Cerberus, but it's Cerebrus, sorry. Cerebrus doing AI research, is that correct? Yes. So we can sit down and we're now gonna have a conversation. It's strange because we're looking at Nicole. Nicole's in the camera, but we're really looking at, she's on the screen, but we're really looking at her over there. So what I've done is I've asked Nolan and Neha to prepare some responses to Nicole's talk and to Nicoles' book as well. And I'm just going to open it up to them to go ahead and respond, and we'll just have a casual conversation. Who wants to begin?
Okay, maybe I'll start things off. Yeah, thanks so much for your talk, book, and your talk. So I guess my first question is, can you elaborate more on how do we build something better? Like you touched on, we have the power to do it, and we could all become builders or something like that. But what are kind of the concrete ways that you think we could improve the current state?
That's a great question. And, I don't have all the answers, and I don't want to give the impression that I do. I think what I really tried to get through in my talk today was the importance of feeling like we should all be part of the conversation. And that when we're thinking about the digital frontier and the kind of future that we want, that we don't sort of leave that future to tech companies and software engineers, because there's often a sense that algorithms are really hard to understand and technology is complicated and it's beyond the capacity of ordinary people to comprehend and therefore engage with. I think this is very convenient for the handful of tech companies that control the infrastructure of modern life, but it's in fact not true, right? Because we engage with this technology every single day. Our tax dollars pay for it. The data that we generate underpins it. And so we have every right to demand a democratic process to decide what that frontier looks like. So that's a very broad answer to your question. I think more specifically, we can start engaging with the institutions that we are part of our everyday lives, and to think about how technology is part of those institutions, and to push back and demand a more just relationship using technology in these institutions. So for example, in the university, right, the university is a good place for students to not only tell different stories, but to really interrogate the relationship between their university and tech companies, and what types of relationships that universities are developing for students and tech companies, to try to create those spaces where you can actually protect your digital identity and start developing different kind of ideals about the digital frontier that you want to create.
Oh, thank you.
Nicole, thanks for that answer, which I think is great, and it's in part why we're all here tonight. I think in your book you write about forms of activism, and you write about digital analog activism. I think specifically in the context of Black Lives Matter, And I'm wondering if, do you see this digital analog activism as part of the answer that, that Nolan is looking for? I mean, is there something to be said for what's happening, a protest happening in Glasgow right now for environmental reasons? Should people be taking it to the streets, so to speak?
I think that often when we talk about politics in the present moment in relation to, for example, our smartphones, we kind of fall easily into technological determinism. So we end up with these very binary assessments of either, we can't organize without social media, or it's just useless organizing, and we need to just get into the streets. And I think we have to find a happy medium, right? When we think about how we've integrated smartphones and social media into our personal lives, it makes perfect sense that we are organizing, using these platforms. And of course, it can be quite powerful. And I can't imagine organizing today without it, right? So it's not a matter of saying, let's just, devalue it, or let's just get rid of it because it's not getting us what we want. I think there's a broader question about the strategies that we need to build a democratic kind of opposition to, sort of overly powerful tech companies or companies in general. So there's not an easy question to say, yes, technology or yes, smartphones are helping us organize or not. It's a question of seeing the limits of that type of organizing and actually thinking about technology as a tool rather than a driver here. So thinking about how we can use it to help us communicate and build solidarity, right? And to actually build a grassroots opposition, and not to lose sight of that as the primary goal.
Oh, I think one thing that's also interesting about so some of the social media platforms like Instagram, for example, they added features so that you could turn off personalized ads. And I had a lot of friends who tried to turn off personalized ads. I turned them off, and the ads became hilariously bad. And it made a lot of people realize that it is actually a useful service that these like recommendation engines provide. Like, even though they have all their flaws, I don't know if people are, it's kind of hard to galvanize support to be like, tear down the big tech companies, when you could also argue that a lot of these products are very integral to our lives, right? Like, that's why we have the smartphone society, because they are extensions of us, and they do help us a lot, right? So it's very complex to try and disentangle exactly how we need to basically govern these tech companies, right? I feel like that needs to happen at the economic level, because these companies are just playing the economic game, exactly like we have defined it as voters. And if you look at China, for example, there you have basically an autocratic system of government, and they're able to like pretty effectively just govern their tech companies. It's like Xi Jinping can just be like, yep, like Alibaba, we don't like what you're doing. It's not in the public interest. Just, you have to give us $10 billion. We're just going to redistribute wealth, and it'll just happen, But in our current system, the corruption is so robust in a democracy that I feel like it's just very difficult to break out of these sorts of systems. Yeah.
A lot to unpack there. So I want to say a couple of things. One is the issue of China, or the example of China as something that we don't want. And I think it's clear that that's true. The kinds of surveillance and use of technology in China to control individuals and to freeze democratic dissent is disturbing, and it's something that we should be very open-eyed toward. But we also shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that we have something, radically divorced from that. I do worry that we are on, when we think about the types of surveillance that US intelligence agencies engage in and their relationship with tech companies, the distance between the types of things that the Chinese government and the US government are doing is not as great as we might hope. And so we need to be very open-eyed and sober about the types of relationships that we have and the business models that we are, undergirding through at least our passive ascent in the United States and Canada. But I think the issue of, what do we do with technology? It's not so easy because we all rely on it in our day-to-day lives. This is an important point. And, one of the points that I make in the book is to emphasize how strategies to deal with our fears and dissatisfaction with our devices or technology or fears about the digital future often end up in this kind of avoidance, or I'm just going to eliminate technology, or I'm going to get a dumb phone, right? I'm not going to use it anymore. And I push back against these kinds of strategies. And one of the reasons why I push back is because often people who are able to, say I'm going to get rid of my smartphone, or I'm going to limit how much I use it, have a lot of technological choice, and they often have the resources to make these kinds of decisions. Whereas, millions of people in the United States, their smartphone is the only way that they're able to access the internet, which is essential for school and work. I know I couldn't even imagine living my life every day without the internet. So I think we need to be conscious of these kinds of power divides when we're devising strategies, right, to build the digital future that we want. So I think it's very important, like you said, to think about those elements.
Hi, Nicole. This is good. Thank you for your talk. Your talk really illustrates the importance of historically situating, but also preserving the historical memories of the technologies we use. Especially when the rhetoric that surrounds technology is that, it's being used as keys to open digital frontiers or to push humanity further, as you've said, whereas people themselves are not necessarily foregrounded in these conversations, especially around our shared or collective futures. So something that you touched upon a little bit in this talk is the notion of resignation, and I'd love to hear more about that. Especially around this ethos of defeat and powerlessness that's been accepted as the norm, especially when we're critiquing technology, and that's, I guess, cemented within our societal fabrics.
Thanks, Neha. Yeah, this is something that I think about a lot, and in part, I think my obsession with it is because I think about capitalism and social movements, and in particular, social movements to challenge the prerogatives and the power of capital to make society in its own image, and what some of those really successful social movements have looked like. So if we think about the labor movement, for example, this is probably one of the most successful social movements in the United States. And one of the reasons why it's been successful is because it was organized labor and unions were able to shift the narrative, right? To actually place power and not just power, but dignity and respect in the worker, right? They were able to actually talk about taking control of technology, right? And having a democratic workplace and actually organizing to challenge companies. And I think we need to take some lessons from the labor movement when we're thinking about technology. And in particular, to, assign ourselves, right, as users and workers, a central role in the story, rather than feeling like we're not smart enough or we're not powerful enough to actually create the technological future that we want. So I think it's really important to acknowledge and to examine these feelings, right, of resignation or fatalism, because we can feel like we're critiquing technology firms or we're critiquing Silicon Valley, but if we're not critiquing in an empowering way, right, if we're critiquing in a kind of fatalistic way, this only ends up making these kinds of narratives that are being presented by Silicon Valley even more powerful, which is why I, put these images up here from popular culture, because I think those are perfect encapsulations of these feelings, right? So if we can start by being aware of this, right, and engage with it, and actually really critically, not just say what we don't like about tech companies, but actually build something better.
Neha, I really liked your question. I'm trying to watch the questions coming in from the live streamed audience as well. And someone said, as a little person, I don't feel like I have any capacity to impact big tech. And I want to turn that question, change the order of things a bit, and turn that question back onto the students, the graduated students here, the professionals, these young professionals, and say, do you feel hopeful? Do you feel defeated? I guess that's one question. I'll do the horrible thing a host does and ask two questions for you to think about. And the second question is, I see a lot of students go off and work co-op jobs at tech companies, and we try to empower students with tech responsible innovation and design methods and thoughts and so on. And I don't know if those students feel empowered if they see something happening at a company that they would be willing to say something or blow a whistle or organize, especially in co-op, because you're on these very short stints. But what about new talented tech professionals? Do you feel defeatist? Do you feel like you would feel comfortable having a say?
Maybe I'll go first. So, I think during co-op, okay, you could take Google, for example, or like Google, the most harmful team would probably be the search team or the YouTube recommendation algorithm team. And then for Facebook, it would be the newsfeed recommendation engine or the Instagram recommendation. But those teams are very tiny and they're very elite and they're very closed off and secretive because they don't want whistleblowers to come in and they need, like, everyone's a PhD and has been there a very long time and everything. So as a co-op student, usually you're not ever even in those situations. Like, I feel like you have to pass certain hurdles in order to be there while something really unethical is happening. And if you've made it that far into that room, then I feel like you've probably already kind of sold your soul a little bit, Yeah, so I'm kind of pessimistic about it.
I'm going to try to answer your first prompt around if I'm feeling defeated or horrible. I think that's not a static or a singular thing for me personally, because in trying to situate myself in the world, I'm also thinking about how that feeds into my work or vice versa. And just by being like, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, what does that mean for the circles that we're already in, right? So even in terms of starting in small ways, so something to do with cooperatives, also there's a lot of examples of those in Nicoles' book, but also just alternative ways of governing data, accountability and practices, just solidarity economies, mutual aid, and mutual aid networks that were made even more visible through technology, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic. All of these actually fill me with hope. And so I try to think about that as much as I can, but it's also okay, I think, to feel dystopian and horrible about things. But I think it's a balance between the both of them.
Neha, you mentioned data governance, and it's a nice segue for a question from the audience. Someone's asking Nicole, and I think either of you can feel comfortable answering as well, is what is the role of government in data governance? And that's a question coming from the live stream. I know it's a huge question, Nicole, but what's your stance on government and in data governance?
Well, this is a huge question, and it's in the United States, it's interesting because you have, a sprawling government with very different parts of it, some of which are extremely secretive and invested in not having data governance and are currently working hand in glove, as I said earlier, with tech companies to constantly develop new forms of surveillance. But on the other hand, you have, much more democratic parts of government who share the same concerns, right? And are talking about the same kinds of issues of tech companies who have too much power over the infrastructure of modern life. So then the question is, all right, what do you actually push for? And what are the policies that would be most effective? And this is, a challenging question. I think what makes me hopeful, and it kind of feeds into what Neha was saying about, a kind of schizophrenic feeling of despair or hopefulness, is that we're really having these conversations right now. If we think about the mobile internet, right, or the creation of the smartphone, this is all pretty new, right? We're kind of working through these questions now. It's not that it's too late, right? Now is the time to be thinking big, right? To be actually demanding big things, right? To be challenging and questioning the core relationships, not to be proposing strategies that kind of nibble around the edges of the business models of these tech companies. And I think that we're starting to move in that direction, but I do think there's the need to actually imagine in a much more radical way the types of digital futures that we want to create. And so the role of governance in this is not to have this kind of top-down, regulatory, demands that Facebook regulate itself, or, commissions, these kinds of sort of piecework, solutions. I think we have to actually dig a little bit deeper and get at the root of the business making model, which is, questions of privacy, which is questions of public speech, which is questions of creating space outside of the kind of surveillance apparatus that's currently being developed by tech companies and intelligence agencies. And this is harder, right? But in order for us to actually get the kind of legislative landscape that we want, we need grassroots demands from below, right? We need a vision of the digital future from below that's democratic, and that is, has big ideas and thinks big, and isn't just about sort of small piecemeal, changes that effectively leave the landscape as it is.
Neha and Nolan, do you have a response to that or any thoughts?
I'm all for it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I think I kind of think very top down when it comes to solutions. So like changing the economic system, or like if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, right? The reason that vaccines are recommended is because that was a top down thing, right? Like some experts were like, this is the right thing to do. We're going to make this, and then everyone, you guys should do that. And I think in tech, that also kind of needs to happen, where some people who are entrenched in Silicon Valley, who are powerful and influential, need to come forward and say, like, this is a viable business model. And a lot of the innovation might just be finding viable business models that can pay for the internet. Because there was a big debate where Apple was trying to basically eliminate all data gathering inside of the Safari browser on iOS and Mac. And basically, if they didn't end up doing it, but if they did that, then who would pay for the internet? It was basically the question everyone was asking. Because right now, if you want to start a business, the number of users you have is like directly proportional to the revenue you're going to get from ads. But if you take away ads, then what incentive is there for anyone to build anything, right? So in our current economic system, like there needs to be some economic or some monetary incentive to build something, right? So that's another open question that I haven't seen anyone answer that way.
Nicole, do you have an answer? In the absence of ads, how do
I do. I would push back a little bit on that, Nolan, in the sense that if we think about the creation of the internet and the funding of venture capital firms and Silicon Valley firms, right now taxpayers are paying for the internet, right? And if we have a different vision for tech companies, right? If we see Facebook and Google as utilities that are necessary, just like electricity and water, we can start to talk about them in different ways, and to not always, not to come back to the question of, well, who will pay for it? Because in many ways, we're already paying for it, right? So part of that is a really good question to think about. Well, if we're creating the internet that we want, how do we actually pay for that? And I think in many ways we already are paying for that, and we already do. We've already, the taxpayers have already paid for a lot of the crucial research that goes into it. We're paying for universities where a lot of this groundbreaking research is quickly patented and privatized, right? We can change these kinds of norms, and in that way I think we'll find ourselves in a situation where it's very easy to create the kind of internet that we want.
I mean, I think like one thing I'll push back again is just there's always a delicate balance when you're governing big companies, right? Like you could take Facebook as the example. It's like the poster child, like very low approval rating, so evil, oh my God, right? But there's also all these little guys in the technology ecosystem, and they matter too, right? So if you take away ads, sure, yeah, we can treat Facebook as a utility, but now what about all the Waterloo entrepreneurs who are going to go make the next big company, right? If you take away that incentive, then that's also a really dangerous thing, right? So we kind of need something that can both treat these things which are utilities as utilities, but also still enable innovation and incentivize it, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree. But part of that has to be to question that ad-based structure, right? And to think about how that impacts the ways that we're creating the digital landscape, and in particular how where the endpoint of that is, right? When we're reliant upon the appropriation of all of this data and constantly generating new data, much of it which is used for advertising, we should be very cautious about where the horizon is, and to try to think about alternative ways. Of course, it's important to provide a space for innovation. That's absolutely true. But I think a lot of innovation also happens in non-commodified spaces, right? And we can foster those spaces as well.
Thank you, Nicole. We're going to take some questions from the live studio audience now. If anyone has questions, I saw one hand go up. And Nicole, I'll listen to the question and then reiterate in the microphone for everyone to hear.
Sounds good.
Nicole, I'm not sure if you heard that, but I'll repeat it anyway for people in the live stream as well. The question is, we have a faculty member from Environment here who is asking a question about the limits of the frontier and mentions the ecological limits and how we used to think that the ecological limits of industrialism was about extraction from the earth, when actually it's about what we are actually pumping out into the sky, so to speak. So the question I think is for Nicole is what are the limits of the frontier? What is that limit? Can we define it? Can we get closer to it, or a more granular? Yeah. So if we've captured the public attention on climate in terms of that frontier and its limits, what about the limits of the digital frontier? How can we define that limit to capture the public's attention?
I think part of thinking about the limits of the digital frontier is, as you say, to delimit it through our demands, right? By raising concerns about the stark ecological costs of the ICT sector. That's not to say that we know or have a clear sense of just how far we can push the digital frontier, but rather to start from the assumption that there is a limit, right? Because often when we talk about, the digital and the language that we use, like the cloud, and we look at these small, sleek, beautiful devices, the ecological toll is even more hidden than when we see the industrial plants that produce automobiles or kind of heavy machinery in these things. It's even more hidden, particularly from users. So part of thinking about the digital frontier is to actually make those limits part of the conversation. And then that's a political question, right? The limits of the digital frontier are ultimately political limits. We don't know how far we can actually push the earth. We have models that are terrifying, but it becomes very much, part of the political project, to my mind.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Nicole, if, and I think it's very right to think about the limits of the digital frontier in terms of ecological impact. And when you think of, the Bitcoin, for example, consuming as much energy as New Zealand or Chile. But I also wonder if the limits might also get back to your comment about thinking of tech in terms of people and not in terms of machines, and thinking about what's happening at Facebook and the sorts of psychological limits that Facebook is actually forcing us to consider right now, the limits of Facebook and Instagram, social media on young people, for example. Do you think there's something there? Is there a limit? Is there a psychological mental health limit that might be a way to get a foothold into this problem?
I think that the ways that we're talking about Facebook in this instance, but social media more broadly, and the conversations, I have two daughters. My older daughter is 13, and the conversations that I have with other parents are ongoing, and we are, thinking very critically about how to introduce technology into our children's lives. And I think this is part of, a broader growing movement to be more intentional and to be more demanding, right, about the types of platforms that we have, but also the ways that our children and young people engage with them. So this is, I think it's an early conversation, but when we think about social limits, right, not just ecological, not just economic, but social limits, these are very much limits that are created through struggle and through conversation and through changing the dialogue, and just having conversations, with other people, whether it's parents or people in the community, and starting to, I mentioned institutions earlier, but also, having kind of conversations in our schools, for example, or our communities, is about, starting to think about what some of these limits should be, and together, right, democratically, creating that new landscape. And so I think the idea of limits is really important to think about in that kind of multi-dimensional way, not a given limit or a natural limit, but actually the limits that we want to create, the limits that we want to put.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the theater? Yeah, go ahead. Thank you, Neil. So we have a question from Neil Nicole, who's a graduate student at the University of Waterloo here. Neil is wondering if our immersion in the digital, thanks to the pandemic, well, he's wondering how that's going to impact us. I think more in terms of what's going to happen when it's done. Is it ruining us somehow, or is it making us better? Is there something to be gained from this 2-year immersion in digital environments that we've all been kind of forced into?
I mean, this is a really big question, right? And I'm constantly looking for data. I think in some ways, the pandemic was an out-of-sample test for both the power of tech companies, but also the power of the left or the grassroots movement to kind of shape, what happens in an emergency situation. And I think that there are some good things and some bad things that come out of it. One, I think, is that the power of tech companies has only been strengthened as a result. And I think most people would agree with this. Even though we are extremely critical, our understanding of our reliance on these companies has only increased, right? It's pretty stark. And many of us are deciding, workplaces are being rearranged, educational plans are being rearranged, and this rearrangement is conditional upon the tech landscape as it is now, right? It's hard to imagine the last 2 years without the existence of Google and Facebook and Microsoft, right? And so thinking about how do we actually reform the tech landscape becomes even more challenging, right? Because we've become even more reliant upon them. But by the same token, I feel like this immersive experience has also forced people to be a lot more reflexive about their relationships with technology. And this is a good thing. It's really forced us to confront our individual, but also our community reliance on technology. And I think it's sort of, this pressure of being alone or being in, our immediate families and interacting through a screen has raised a lot of questions that I think might speed up some of the critiques and conversations and push us, a little bit further and faster to actually fix some of the things that we're critical of. So it's this tension, right? It's this kind of test that is really interesting. And I'm waiting to see, what the long-term results are. Like, what does it mean to say, we're going to work from home from now on? Like, what are the long-term impacts of that in terms of our feelings of solidarity, our feelings, our identity, our attachment to work, to home? I mean, these are really big, interesting sociological questions, and I'm excited to think about them. I don't have an easy answer for that.
I'm going to turn that question actually on to Neha. Sorry, surprise. I know you think a lot about these things, and you just finished a degree where you've been thinking about all these things. And I'm just wondering if you could address the question about the pandemic, and you can get personal if you want, or if you can just share some thoughts about how you think it's going to impact everyone coming out of it, or how it has impacted us.
Just listening to Nicole's response, it also brought up the question of access for me. So even in the pandemic, right? Like, who got to access connectivity, and even tying that back to smartphones, like smartphones present the illusion of connectivity, that if you have a smartphone, you're connected, but that's not true. And especially during the pandemic, there's been many internet outages. There's been so many shutdowns in different places, particularly to suppress dissent and all these things. So I don't know. I think access was the thing that came up for me the most. Also in relationship to reflection. So if I were to reflect on my own use of technology, how would that be, I guess? Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Thank you, Neha. We have another question up top here. Another big question, Nicole. The question has to do with your discussion in your book about the liberatory potential of smartphones and of digital technology in general. And the student who is speaking is doing a PhD in English, and she's interested in the kinds of power dynamics and the socioeconomic divides involved in this liberatory potential. And is there a risk that many people will be left out of this along the same old lines that we see all the time in terms of power asymmetries and culture, that this liberatory potential will only impact people who are more privileged and who have access to engage in that potential because of access to tech or just pure social power?
That's a great question. I think Neha just hit some really important points when we're thinking about the pandemic and schooling, for example, and how in rich cities, like the city I live in, Cambridge, Massachusetts, the school district was able to provide every student with a laptop to bring home, and also a hotspot in case they were had patchy or no internet connectivity. So it was, a bit of a hurdle, but it was somewhat seamless, relatively speaking. we see a very different story for, millions of other people in the United States, particularly people who live in rural areas. So that kind of access, right, that kind of engagement is really limited by income and by accessibility. Other types of engagement, I think, are a bit different, right? If we think about smartphone usage and who owns a smartphone, this is something that's much more widespread, right? One of the interesting things about the mobile internet and smartphones in general is how widespread the adoption is and how quickly people have taken them up and integrated them intimately into their lives, and how they use them in unexpected and fascinating ways, in particular in organizing. So, yes, there are definitely serious questions of accessibility, but also I think that there are kind of exciting liberatory potentials because of the ease with which people are able to get and use smartphones and to communicate with each other, right? Obviously, we shouldn't overstate the potential political impact of connecting on social media, right? You need on the ground door knocking and talking. But when we're thinking about the liberatory potential, I think we have to be clear about what sphere we're talking about, because it's important not just for illuminating possibilities, but also for shining a light on folks who are actually locked out, right? And to think about what spheres we're thinking about that lack of access in.
Nicole, thanks. I'm going to ask one last question. It's inspired by a question from the live stream. It's also a nice segue for a thanks. This talk was sponsored in part by the Faculty of Arts, and all of the faculties of the university are participating and are co-sponsoring these events, as is Communitech. So I think that that's a great endorsement for the importance of this conversation. The talk has to do with a different kind of power asymmetry, or this question, a different kind of power asymmetry, which is that even at the University of Waterloo, there's a power symmetry, some people think, amongst faculties, that there are some faculties that hold a great deal of cultural capitals, particularly STEM faculties. And the arts, for example, may feel that quite acutely, and this question coming from the chat is inspired by that. What role do the arts and humanities have to play in this notion of organizing or of political impact and so on? What role do people who are trained in these areas have to play? What can they do?
I think that's a great question, and a central question, in the sense that one of my broader points today was that when we're thinking about the digital frontier that we're creating, it's important to have voices from everywhere be part of that conversation. So if we're thinking about the university and the contributions made by, say, the English department or the sociology or history or the humanities more broadly, the voices from these places are central. They provide a perspective and a set of skills and knowledge that we cannot create a just and democratic digital frontier without. They give us tools and perspectives that are sorely lacking, I think, in not just sort of the tech world, but in the conversation about technology, right? Because there's often a sense that when we're talking about, the digital future, that this is something that we should, let the experts talk about. When in fact, the perspective that we need is often provided by, a different kind of voice who has a different sort of cultural toolbox, right? Who can actually to bring new concepts. So I think it's absolutely essential to have, all of these voices, and a university is a kind of microcosm of that. And so that's why I was really excited, Marcel, when we were talking about this series that you're putting together, and how it really is, kind of bringing in these different perspectives for folks to have a conversation together. So I think It's really important.
Well, Nicole, I think you've certainly equipped us with some tools to think through these problems and hopefully to take action. Before we give Nicole a round of applause, I just want to thank all the sponsors once again, the faculties, also all the staff here, the tech people who put all this together, the live streaming. This wasn't an easy thing to coordinate. The people working at theater as well, and the Office of Research at the University of Waterloo. And I want to thank Matt Borland for creating the poster for this event as well, and for being a comrade in arms. And I think with that, let's give Nicole well, before we give Nicole a round of applause, let's give Nolan and Neha a round of applause. Thank them. And then Nicole, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and we hope to hear more from you soon.
Thanks, Marcel, and thank you, everyone.